In 2017 alone, the United States made $41.7 billion off of spectrum auctions. So that means that they're leasing spectrum to third parties and they are keeping the money. The money goes into Treasury. And some of that land, there's 56.2 million acres of tribal land in America. And so if you take all of that spectrum on those lands and you're selling it and the US is keeping the money, that's extreme disenfranchisement, really twice. One, because tribes aren't getting that economic benefit of the spectrum leases. And two, they're not getting the benefits of actually being able to utilize spectrum by setting up their own tribal community networks.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Impact Everywhere, the podcast that looks for people having a positive impact in unexpected places. Our guest today is Darrah Blackwater, and she is an Indigenous activist fighting for spectrum sovereignty. She's Navajo, and in this conversation, she'll sometimes refer to herself as a Diné. And I'm super excited to have her on this podcast because I hadn't heard about the concept of spectrum sovereignty until being referred to her. And I was referred to her by one of the listeners named Maya Win, who is a musician. So thank you, Maya. Darrah has a really interesting backstory where she started off as a tennis coach in China and got her first taste of activism when she walked over 1,400 miles from Zhongshan to Beijing to raise money for organizations that empower people with disabilities. From there, she spent a year of law school working on tribal issues in Washington, D.C., and that's where she stumbled across the concept of spectrum sovereignty, which is basically the idea that Native nations should have exclusive rights to the electromagnetic spectrum that floats over their lands. Since then, Darrah has spent her time hiking across a Colorado trail to raise awareness, all the while talking about the digital divide and Indigenous issues in written papers and research. This week, we're going to start off a little bit different because Darrah wants to introduce herself. Here we go.
My name is Darrah Blackwater. I am a citizen of the Diné Nation, also known as the Navajo Nation. Darrah Blackwater Yenishia, Besh Bachain Nishlin Dotsina Jenny Bashichin, Ado Besh Bachai Dashiche, Ado Tach Ini Dashinale. I am originally from Farmington, New Mexico, but today I am talking to you from Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is treaty territory of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And I'm not actually sure whose homelands. That is something that I should probably figure out and will post to my Instagram.
Thank you so much for that introduction. On my end, I am currently dialing in from Montreal, which is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee Mohawk. I'm so glad we were able to make this podcast work because we've been trying to schedule it for so long and just constantly having internet issues. So why don't we just start there? Talk to me about this digital divide that you are currently located inside of.
I've been hanging out in rural Arkansas for the past couple months, and it's not a place I ever expected to be. I'm working remotely, so I can be anywhere right now, but my partner is living out in rural Arkansas. And it is really interesting hearing people's issues. Hanging out with him, he lives in a hunting cabin, like off-grid, no connectivity or anything. And it's really the first time I've ever actually experienced the digital divide for myself. I've talked about it so much and I've advocated for the closing of the digital divide, but I had never actually experienced the digital divide and the frustration and all of the little things that you don't really think about. Like we even struggled on connectivity, like getting to this podcast. And it's things like that where you just feel like you're falling so behind, you're missing opportunities, you're frustrating people because you don't have connectivity. And I think that really is one of the things that translates to both minority communities that are in rural areas like my reservation and rural white America, where they're dealing with these same issues of feeling like there's just nothing that you can do. It's like you have no power. And that power is put in companies that really aren't looking out for you. It's such a frustrating feeling and such a disempowering feeling. But then from those same people, I'm also getting microaggressions of things that, ideas that they have about what it means to be Native that are really racist and wrong, that they have never realized are racist and wrong. Indians and firewater don't mix, whatever. And it's just, oh my God, I feel so much resonance with you. And then you say something like that, and it makes me want to slap you across the face. There's so much overlap. And then there's dividers that there's still ignorance. And that's really, I guess, why I've taken on this role. When I think about who I am or what I'm doing in the world, one of the words that comes to mind is advocate, but I feel more lately like an educator more than anything. And I think a lot of my advocacy is education. And just when I get a microaggression or when I'm faced with ignorance, I've had to learn how to take that breath and really just go, okay, choose to teach instead of react in this moment. And it's really hard to do. And it's taken me years to learn how to do that.
So walk me through the last microaggression that you talked through.
I think it was the Indians and Firewater one. It was in Arkansas, and it was a neighbor, my partner's neighbor. It was on Christmas. I spent Christmas out there, and she asked me if I wanted a Bloody Mary. And I said, oh, no, thank you. And she said, you don't drink, do you? And I said, no, I don't drink. I quit drinking in September, which was a decision for me that it's taken years for me to come to that. And there were all sorts of ideas around in my brain. One was like, I've seen alcohol be so destructive to my communities, but then also there's that, that thing in me, ego, that's pushing against that and saying, but I don't have a problem. Why should I have to stop drinking just because I come from a community that has problems with alcohol? And then also just watching it with my relationships. I got out of a relationship this summer where my partner at the time drank a lot. And we were in California, and how people in California approach alcoholism is they go, oh, it's wine country, and I just really like wine. And if you're white, then you're allowed to just be into wine. But if you're native and you drink that much, it means that you're a drunk or you're just good for nothing. And so I really started to understand the different ways and the double standards that we put on alcohol culture among different cultures. And and it came down to just like wanting to be healthier and wanting my relationships to be better. So anyway, it was a decision that I came to that was long and thought out and emotional and just like a really good decision for me. And this woman, when she said, oh yeah, Indians and Firewater. And in that moment, she just reduced all of that, this like long thought out emotional decision of mine that I made to better my life into, oh yeah, your genetics don't allow you to partake in alcohol because I'll turn into a savage monster. In that moment, I felt so small. It was like, no, this is actually something that I decided for my life. And you're attaching all of these assumptions to it that are really hurtful. And in the moment, I didn't say anything and I didn't do anything. I just took it and I thought about it later. It was Christmas Day. It was a family thing that wasn't my family. I didn't want to blow up somebody else's Christmas.
Did you end up trying to teach? Because I like this idea of taking the time to pause and reflect, is this the right time? Because you don't want to go around and preach. No one likes a preacher. I'm a vegan. You don't want to just like attack people. As a vegan, people get really offended. So first you pause, you start asking questions. But when you do want to engage, what are some tips or tricks that you have developed to make sure that people are receptive to your message?
I would say breath and tone is a big part of it, because it almost feels like handling a bomb, and I don't want to make somebody defensive. My intention is not to make someone feel stupid or to make them feel like they did something wrong, even though that's maybe what I want to do because what they said hurt me. And so I know I have the power to hurt them back. Maybe that's my knee-jerk reaction, but it honestly feels like being a kindergarten teacher of, okay, this is the knowledge base we're starting with. I recognize that you came to this knowledge because of your environment, because of your upbringing, because you've never met an Indigenous person before, that you have been educated by an American education system that doesn't teach you about the genocide that has been inflicted upon Indigenous people and has actually cultivated racism in you, that you being this person, and the general public. And so I have to really come with an understanding of that they've never thought about these issues. Most people that I talk to have probably either never met an Indigenous person or have never thought about an Indigenous issue before in their entire lives. It's all that I think about. It's something that I have to break my mind away from in order to have relationships and feed myself. But I have to realize that most people don't have these thoughts in their heads, maybe ever. I would say a lot of Americans probably live and die without ever really thinking through an issue pertinent to an Indigenous person or community. So I just have to come with that understanding and have compassion for that, because nobody teaches it. It's not taught to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice. Curiosity is definitely one of those tools that we could all use a little bit more of. After all, I think it was Michelle Thaler in one of my previous episodes that said that it's really hard to hate somebody when you're curious about them. Do you have a particular technique to cultivate your own curiosity, especially since you seem to be in these difficult conversations more often than the average person?
There's a brilliant Indigenous scholar. Her name is Kim Tallbear. And I really like what she talks about with studying Americans that are not Indigenous and flipping the script. Like, we are studied so much by archaeologists and anthropologists, and that's really how they've come to all these conclusions about us that aren't even necessarily true, is people coming from outside of our communities and studying us through their own lens without even understanding an Indigenous interpretation of the world. And so I really feel like I'm just learning how people are coming to these issues and trying to understand that right now. I'm learning a lot about how people see these issues and what people know or don't know. And that's really helpful to me to become a more compassionate teacher and advocate.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to switch gears a little bit over here and talk about the thing that you've spent the most amount of time studying most recently, and that is the topic of spectrum sovereignty. Could you just give a recap to me and the listeners a little bit about what spectrum sovereignty is and how you stumbled across it?
I have been working on this issue of spectrum sovereignty for a couple years now. I actually just finally got word that my paper that includes this is published in the Indigenous Peoples Journal of Law, Culture, and Resistance at the University of California, Los Angeles. And it is about tribal broadband, how it can be a solution to the challenges of economic development on tribal lands. So spectrum, for those who don't know, is essentially radio waves. It is what a wireless connection uses. It's a natural resource. And so you can just imagine all of the data just riding these waves from one point to another. And these radio waves are really valuable, and they have different kinds of value. Economic value, because you can lease them to companies that can use them for cell phone service or Wi-Fi, but also they have this value that you can utilize them and you can create connections, you can build networks on them. And so I came to this issue when I was in DC. I was working for the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs in 2018, and they were short-staffed, so they started sending me to meetings, and some of these meetings were on the issue of the digital divide and broadband in Indian country. And they were just talking about anyone who's been out to a res or really rural areas, that the connectivity is lacking. And that idea that these people in rural areas and tribal areas don't have as good of connection, or maybe even any connection, that is the digital divide. And that is the frustration that we opened this conversation with, where you feel like you lose opportunities. You can't run a business online. You can't do telehealth. You can't go to school online. There are so many things that you can't do in this day and age if you don't have a connection, an internet connection. And I was learning about the digital divide and just trying to get to the root of the problem of, okay, but why is it like this? I get that, but that's a symptom. What is the root? And one of the roots that I identified was this access to spectrum. So it's regional. This spectrum that is being used in Tulsa, it's not like you can bottle it and ship it and use it in California. If there's spectrum in Tulsa, it has to be used in this moment in Tulsa. And these are just natural electromagnetic waves that occur on the land. They were here long before we were here. They'll be here long after we leave here. They're just, like I said, a natural resource naturally occurring on the land. So once I started to understand spectrum as a natural resource, that it's not something that's made by AT&T, T-Mobile, whomever, which is what the FCC will have you believe, but it is part of the land. Then I thought about it as any other natural resource. In the context of Indigenous law and policy, we've had to fight tooth and nail for every single natural resource, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be land, water, clean air. We've had to really go to battle and argue over this both on the land itself in a situation like Standing Rock and or in the courts. And every other resource has really been heavily litigated. And my view is that spectrum is the next one. Spectrum is the resource of the future because it is worth so much money in perpetuity. In 2017 alone, the United States made $41.7 billion off of spectrum auctions. So that means that they're leasing spectrum to third parties and they are keeping the money. The money goes into Treasury. And some of that land, there's 56.2 million acres of tribal land in America. And so if you take all of that spectrum on those lands and you're selling it and the US is keeping the money, that's extreme disenfranchisement, really twice. One, because tribes aren't getting that economic benefit of the spectrum leases. And two, they're not getting the benefits of actually being able to utilize spectrum by setting up their own tribal community networks. Whether they want to outsource that job or whether they want to keep it in-house and do it themselves, it doesn't matter. But if you don't have the spectrum, you can't create a network for your people. And nobody's going to do it for you. That's why the digital divide exists, is because these companies who are controlling spectrum and controlling the assets and resources necessary to create a broadband connection, they're not doing it in these rural tribal areas. And so if you are not incentivizing the people who have the power to do it, and you're not giving tribes, the native nations, the resources to do it themselves, then the digital divide will just persist and it will continue. And that's what we're seeing really everywhere right now.
Cool. So I just want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea of spectrum, because it wasn't a very familiar topic to me when I first discovered it. And I'm sure it's maybe the first time so many people are hearing it. When I first heard it, I was like, so if the spectrum is just electromagnetic waves that exist around the planet, it doesn't really belong to anyone. It only has value when data is sent on these waves. And so you need to be able to send it and you need to be able to receive it. And those are the big expensive hardware that a T-Mobile or Sprint or an AT&T may build. And what I'm hearing from you is currently the spectrum is there, but there is no one sending or receiving data because there's no financial incentive to do it. But if a tribal nation wanted to set up their own service, and if they had the capital to do it, I'm assuming it's really expensive, they still wouldn't be allowed. Is that correct?
If they don't have the rights to utilize the spectrum, if they don't have rights to the lease for it. I'll give you an example. So about a year ago, we were down in Waimanalo, Hawaii with the nation of Hawaii. And they did end up getting their spectrum rights over their land in order to set up their own community network. And so with two nonprofits that I work with, one is called MuralNet, the other is the Internet Society. They supported and helped sponsor this community build for the nation of Hawaii. And so it took a group of volunteers 2 days. The nation did a lot of their own groundwork. They dug a trench and brought fiber to their community. But then we set up the base stations, like the antennas, and pointed it in the right direction and got it connected to the fiber and up and running and connected it to a router on each house. And I think that roughly for a small area, it costs about $15,000. It's not that expensive. A lot of Native nations can find grants or, sponsorships like with the Internet Society or MuralNet or whomever, or they can fund it themselves. Not every tribe is hurting for money. A lot of tribes can fund these things themselves and set up their own economic development business plan to be an internet service provider. It's very possible if you have spectrum, if you have the rights to your spectrum. And if you don't, none of that is possible.
And what percentage of the cost does that really represent? So assuming you had a fiber line that you could build a tower around,
sure.
And so you're saying it's only $15,000 to get something set up, then how much would that lease have cost the nation of Hawaii if it hadn't been ceded back to them?
Oh, if they had to buy the spectrum?
Yeah.
Oh, surely millions and millions. In Hawaii especially, I'm sure like multiple millions of dollars. They did this tribal priority window for specifically, it's called the 2.5 gigahertz band of spectrum. And all that means is that it's this one channel. Think about it like a radio channel. So they got rights to broadcast over one radio channel, which is really good for a rural area because it goes really far and it can go through foliage pretty well. Because those are the other concerns. You have to think about what spectrum is going to be good to go through maybe like adobe walls if you live in pueblos. Or there we had to think about like banana trees. And when those big banana leaves get wet, the spectrum, just like any other signal, is going to bounce every which way. And so you have to think about having a clear shot to different antennas. And then, of course, you have to think about cultural concerns, which is why a lot of Native nations don't want outsiders to come in and do things on their land, because they don't want towers going up near cultural sites. They don't want things being desecrated that they want to protect. They don't want to give rights of way sometimes to outsiders because they're afraid of contracting at all, because why wouldn't they be afraid to contract with outsiders after all of our treaties have been broken? So these are all sorts of challenges that we have to navigate and think through in the Indigenous broadband field, because there are many, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. We've seen Native nations do it and do it very well.
This idea of licensing and owning the spectrum by the government, is there a single government in the world that doesn't operate in that way?
So my understanding is that the Maori down in New Zealand have rights and access to their spectrum because in their treaty with the New Zealand government, they have the words things treasured. And my understanding is that includes everything from children to spectrum and resources. And they've been successful in at least getting rights to some spectrum through those treaty words, things treasured, because that's all encompassing of really anything that's important. In our treaties, the words that I think that spectrum falls under is for use and occupation. That's where a lot of our natural resource rights are found. They identify the land. This land is for this Native nation for use and occupation as long as the rivers flow and the grass grows. And that essentially means that everything you need to live on this land is yours forever in perpetuity. And my argument is spectrum is what we need to live on the land. In 2021, especially in the midst of a pandemic, you have to have telehealth. You have to have Wi-Fi and any sort of connectivity in order for kids to go to school right now, in order for people to run businesses right now. It is so important. And for use and occupation is what our treaties say. And spectrum absolutely falls under that because you have to have it in order to set up networks, in order to participate in the world in this day and age.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Would you say that short-term plan is fighting for spectrum sovereignty for Indigenous nations, but the long-term plan spectrum should be available to anyone who lives on a land, and why should it be managed by a government? Or do you not think that is the case?
I wouldn't go that far. I think that Native nations have government-to-government relationships with the United States. We have been sovereign since time immemorial, as long as we've been here, and we continue to be sovereign. The Supreme Court has referred to us as domestic dependent nations, but the truth is that we were nations long before the United States was a nation. And so there is this government to government relationship that needs to be respected. And that's really, to me, why it's such a slap in the face that the United States won't recognize spectrum rights for these nations, because they were governments that do govern that land. We do govern our lands. And so my view is that for me, like I'm Diné, that the Diné Nation, the Navajo Nation, should be recognized as also governing the spectrum on the lands that they already govern and have governed, those lands and many more lands that we've been disenfranchised from since time immemorial. And that should continue with spectrum in that bundle of rights.
That's fair enough. Thanks for answering that question. I'm sure that you have a number of critics that have probably read your things who may come out against it. What do you think are the most compelling arguments that critics say against you, and how might you respond to that?
I don't think any of their arguments are compelling. I haven't heard any compelling argument. In June or July, I talked to Jessica Rosenworcel. She is a commissioner of the FCC. And we really didn't even touch on it because I've already gotten the answer from many FCC officials, which is basically, nope, you just don't get them. And it's okay, but why? And they go, nope, we just don't recognize them. And they say that essentially it wasn't encompassed in the treaty because spectrum rights weren't specifically mentioned in our treaties, that we've lost out on those rights, which is complete crap because none of the natural resources are specifically mentioned in the treaties. It comes down to for use and occupation. And it's what do Native nations need to allow their citizens to use and occupy land. And we need water. We need the land itself. We need sunlight. I think the best comparison that I can think of is sunlight. If the FCC or any government agency put up a huge canopy over the Native Nation and was taking all of the sunlight and using those solar panels, taking all the sunlight from over the Navajo Nation and getting money, selling that power to the city of Los Angeles and keeping the money, people would have a lot to say about that. And it's because you can see it. The reason that it's harder to make this argument and conceptualize is because spectrum is, you can't see it. It's not tangible. But if it was sunlight, which sunlight is electromagnetic spectrum, then we would have a lot to say about it. And so that's where we're at.
I love that analogy. I was hoping you'd bring it up. In order to raise awareness for spectrum sovereignty, you went on this hike down the Colorado Trail. What do you see the milestones that you need to hit in order to see the change that you wish to see happen?
I've seen a lot already. Yesterday, I was just talking to a Georgia Tech student, a PhD student, who is writing about not just this subject, but this subject is in the bundle of what they're writing about. So I think we are heading toward critical mass as far as people waking up to this, agreeing with me. I've had quite a few conversations with tribal leaders over the years who totally agree. And the tribal leaders and elders, they know what spectrum is. That's another argument that is just so frustrating to me, that people have told me they're not using it. Tribes aren't using spectrum. So if they've never used it, then they've lost their right to claim it because they haven't used it. And it's just a question of how. Yeah, maybe we haven't used it in the way that it's being used right now, but we have a very good understanding of the way that energy works. We have a good understanding of the way that prayers work and that thoughts and intentions travel. I've split hairs over this with people, but I think about bats and whales and the way that we understand how energy can move through mediums, in that case, air molecules or water molecules, in order to send signals. And it's a very similar thing with spectrum, except the medium is different that it's moving through. And so I know that elders and people who understand traditional Indigenous knowledge and medicine have a good understanding of what spectrum is and what it's capable of and how we've utilized it in the past. We've just utilized it in a different way than connectivity companies are utilizing it right now. And so it's not that we haven't used spectrum, and that's one of the arguments that I've heard against my ideas is, well, you haven't used it. Well, yes, we have, just not in the same way and maybe not the same frequencies.
Got it. So when it comes to activism and when it comes to building this critical momentum, what are your next steps to raise awareness for this and to build up to that tipping point in order to see the policy changes that you hope to see?
Yeah, really just having conversations like this is important to me, educating the general public, because one, I just think it's such a cool issue. And I get so much really good feedback by people who are really interested in this issue. Every time I do a podcast about it or speak about it publicly, I think that people are starting to understand. It took me a long time to grasp the concept. Conceptually, it's hard to let it sink in. But once it really sunk in, that it is a natural resource and that we know this is something that is as Indigenous to our communities and our land as we are. Once I recognized it as a relative and something that is part of the way forward, then it started clicking into place. And I think that's happening for a lot of people right now. That's what I'm hoping to do, is help them along that journey of helping it click and letting it click and helping them to recognize it as well. So that's a big part of it, is just talking about it, writing about it. I've got a couple things in the works as far as getting these messages and these ideas out in print. I have quite a few op-eds about it, and that was my push for a long time, was just getting it in print, and that has been fruitful. So yeah, I have a couple ideas in the works about how to do that in different ways, and I'm just so excited really anytime anybody wants to talk about it, because obviously I can talk about it forever. I think it's so interesting.
Right. And are you the person that coined spectrum sovereignty, or did you borrow or find it from somewhere else?
There was one hashtag of it when I found it. I started talking about it, and this nonprofit that I mentioned before, MuralNet, had talked about the issue before, and they had tagged one thing on Instagram with spectrum sovereignty, but at the time, they didn't have a native board and they didn't have a native CEO. And so they didn't really feel like it was their place to really coin that term or talk about that term. That was just more momentum for me of, okay, I'm seeing this. Other people who are way smarter than me are seeing this and think that there's really something here to move forward with.
I think it's really great that you're building how do I like to describe this? The grammar and poetry around an issue so that it makes it easier for people to understand what it is and how to talk about it, and creating all these narratives and stories. When it comes to hiking as part of your activism, is this something that you embody as part of a strategy, or is this really like a lifestyle choice?
Oh, it's so selfish. I was completely over law school by the time I graduated. And all I wanted to do the whole time I was in law school was get out on the land. You're reading about the land, you're reading about natural resources, you're sitting inside for 3 years reading about all of these things that are so important, and you're not actually out there. You never see it. You're never out there experiencing it or doing it, or like fully experiencing the beauty of what people are talking about and in trying to protect. You're just trying to care, because my experience of law school was like just reading hundreds and hundreds of pages every week. And I craved the real experiences that would actually make me care again. I had a memory of what it felt like to experience the land and love land and really care about it. And then it just felt like it was getting farther and farther away and quieter in my brain. I knew that I needed to reconnect in a really big way. And I had my eye on the Colorado Trail, and I knew that I needed to tie it to something bigger, because if I was just out there doing it and not talking about it, not talking about the history, not having a platform to really talk about the issues and the genocide that took place on that land and the disenfranchisement of Native communities from that land, or vice versa, I needed to be able to talk about it as I went along. And so it was really the perfect combination for me of advocacy and refilling my own cup.
Nice. When I was researching this conversation with you, I noticed that 3 out of the 4 podcasts that I stumbled across were hiking podcasts.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those interesting things where you did it because it was something that really spoke to you. But in another way, it's also enabled you to reach a completely different demographic of individuals, people who actually love being outdoors. So you ended up being able to find that connection. And I think it's really cool that regardless of where your interests lie, you can always find a way to fuse what you care about with what you enjoy doing and putting those two together.
Absolutely. And I'll just praise that community for a second, because there is a lot of problematic parts of the outdoor industries and a lot of these mindsets in the outdoor space.
Can you tell us about what these problematic things are?
Yeah, I think this is really common. Like you see all sorts of John Muir tributes and quotes. And there's this idea of outdoor spaces in America being so pristine and wild and amazing. And there's just something really missing in that narrative, which is that Indigenous peoples have been murdered for and marched off of those lands at gunpoint. And these lands were our homes. This is where people lived. This is where Indigenous peoples raised children, and they were stewards of that place, and they lived there for thousands and thousands of years. And then Americans come along and colonization begins, and they're marched at gunpoint off of these lands so that they can become national parks, and so that mostly white people can go into these lands and put their butts on Instagram. It's just not something that we really talk about ever in America as a whole, but especially in outdoor spaces and communities of like, why do we think this land is pristine? Because Indigenous people have been marched off of it. And now we talk about it as if they're just these wild spaces, where those used to be spaces that were our homes that we were stewards of. We managed the fire, we grew our crops, we hunted there, we had trade routes going through there. And so just having those conversations about the history of national parks, the history of Indigenous homelands that are no longer reservations, that Indigenous people no longer live on or have any legal right to. That's a huge problem. And we just don't really talk about it. The trail signs don't tell the full story. Schools don't tell the full story. The trail associations that manage the trails don't tell the full story. And so where are these people going to get educated? And that is a question that keeps me up at night. Walking through those lands was a really emotional experience because when you're out there in the middle of nowhere and land for hundreds of miles and that people were massacred on that land just so that cows can graze on it, and people who have the time and disposable income, who are mostly white people, can walk through it and pitch their expensive tents on it and eat their instant mashed potatoes. Those are the only reasons that people were killed and marched off of that land. That is a really hard truth to digest. And that's what I was doing out there. And it was really hard. And I've found a lot of really great allies who will sit with me in that. Even if they don't fully understand it, they'll sit with me in that.
I'm curious to ask you, because this is not the first major hike that you've done. Mm-hmm. What was it like for you to walk 1,400 miles through China from an experience perspective? And did you ask yourself all these questions about the history of the land you were walking through as you were trekking through China?
I was younger. I think I was 24 when I did that. And I can look back at that and see my own problematic mindset in how I came to that and the way that I did that. And also honoring myself for just knowing that I was doing it to help. Like the goal of that was to raise money for a foster home for children with disabilities. And my walking partner, Anne Liang, she and I just wanted to do something awesome and raise a bunch of money for this shared passion that we had. And Anne is a history buff. And so I did learn a lot about the history of China and China politics just vicariously through that walk and through that hike. Obviously learned a lot about the culture and language and everything in China, but I was such a baby about it looking back. And if I were to do it again, like I definitely would want to do it with more curiosity and less complaining. I was uncomfortable. And I let that get in the way of me really seizing every opportunity to learn and understand everything that you're asking about and everything that there was an opportunity to learn about. So in some ways, I feel like I wasted it, but I guess that's what they say, that youth is wasted on the young. And yes and no.
Yeah. I guess the reason I ask is because China's history is so much more complex. There is no, if you keep rolling back 100 years for the next 5,000 years, you're going to discover a new group of people that took over a piece of the land and someone owned it before.
Surely.
And it's just like, it's complex. So it has more weight in terms of, I think, more change and more bloodshed in its history, yet less clarity on what was right and what was wrong and what belongs to whom and for how long. I guess I just want to maybe open this up a little bit more to listeners who are just really curious, maybe not necessarily about Spectrum, but also the Indigenous culture and are curious about your mission. How would you like to invite people who are listening to this for the first time and who are inspired? How can they be a part of your movement?
I always struggle with this question because I think everyone has such unique things to offer that it's hard for me to pigeonhole an entire population of potential allies to tell them how to be allies. I think it's their own journey that they have to figure out what they have to offer on their own. But in guiding that, everything that we've been talking about as far as listening is huge. Like when somebody really listens to what Indigenous people has to say without judging it, it's always such a beautiful thing. And I would say just try to indigenize your bookshelf, try to indigenize your playlist, try to indigenize your, podcast choices. Like, just listen to these voices and immerse yourself in it, and give yourself an opportunity to understand what some of these experiences are like to be Indigenous in 2021. And it's different for everyone. It's different for someone living in Tulsa, like I do. It's different for someone living on the res. It's different for someone living on the Navajo res versus the Dakota or Lakota res. It's just, there are such vast experiences, and there's so much to know, and there's so much to celebrate and mourn and learn about. And it's really however you want to come to these issues. There's many different things you can learn about and be involved in, and ways to contribute. And I think always asking, what is my place and what is appropriate? Sometimes you just have to feel it out, and nobody's going to tell you, and you just have to listen. You have to be open to feedback of, hey, I appreciate what you were trying to do there, but I don't think that was really appropriate. And say, okay, so sorry. My intentions are only good. I'm going to move forward better. Or sit on the sidelines and watch for a little while and say, oh man, I wish I would have gotten involved in that. And then you do that next time. So I think it's really just that ebb and flow of listening and getting involved and reeling back, and just moving forward with more information as you go all the time.
Okay. And on that note, then, what are some good voices to start listening to? Do you have any, top 2 or top 3 recommendations?
Ooh, that's really good. So one, I'm trying to remember the handle. It's Native Park Ranger, I think is what it is. I'm looking for my phone. I love everything that she's doing, because she really talks about everything that I talk about. I feel relieved watching her stuff, because she really has good things to say. Oh, Native Power Ranger, Native_Power Rangers. And yeah, she posts a lot of great stuff.
This is on Instagram?
Instagram, yeah. And then my friend Nate, he's Diné, and he is a photographer who just, if anyone's interested in art, he posts the most beautiful things. That's dark listed photography. And then if you want a good kind of, this is what's happening on a res right now. And a lot of these are Diné recommendations, because I am Diné, but there's 573 other federally recognized tribes and even more actual Native nations. But my friend, her tagline is, or she's my cousin actually, sunshine.919. She is really spearheading the effort of getting supplies out to elders and people in the community out in Monument Valley, Utah, which is Diné territory. She just graduated from Duke, and she's going to do great things. Indigenous Women Hike is a huge, really advocate, and just has such brilliant things to say about outdoor community stuff. And just watching some of these people and seeing who they tag and who they're following, just do your research. Evan James Benali Atwood is also another Diné artist that I am just I fangirl over all the time. I just love them. Yeah, there are so many really incredible Indigenous artists and scholars. And the person I mentioned before, Kim Tallbear, I'm not sure she does Instagram, but if you just put her name into YouTube or whatever, her work will pop up, and she's a brilliant Indigenous scholar. And one of the podcasts that I always recommend to people is All My Relations. And they talk about so many cool Indigenous issues that I learned so much from them. So that's a good place to start too.
Cool. Thanks for all those recommendations. I'll make sure to add them into the show notes.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you. It's the question that I always like to end with. And that is, if you had a microphone to the world and you could say one thing, what would that thing be?
Indigenous people are still here, and we are participating in the world today, and our issues are very important.
All right, cool. Thank you very much. And if people want to follow you and your journey and to learn more about spectrum sovereignty, where should they head?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is @BlackwaterSoul. And yeah, sometimes I do it and sometimes I get tired of it, but I pop in and have somewhat intelligent things to say every once in a while.
Very intelligent stuff. Thank you so much for being on this podcast and sharing your story.
Of course. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Alrighty, folks, so there you have it. That was Darrah Blackwater, also known as Blackwater Soul on Instagram. She is continuing to battle to fight and raise awareness for spectrum sovereignty. If you search spectrum sovereignty on Google, you can find more information about the issue and see how it may affect a local community close to you, especially if you live close to a reservation. It's definitely something that I have to investigate over here in Canada. I think our system is a little bit different, but I'm really curious to learn more. And that's why I do this podcast, to discover people like Darrah and to learn a little bit more about issues. I've been thinking that it might be fun to find an editor. So if that is something you may be interested in, please hit me up at hi@impacteverywhere.org. And of course, if you have feedback, feel free to send it in. And with that said, folks, I hope you all have a wonderful week, because impact is everywhere.